All right. Thank you so much, Alex. And look, it's an absolute privilege to be here speaking with you this evening. As well as being a national educator at Autism New Zealand, I'm the mother of a 15-year-old autistic boy. He attends a mainstream school here on the North Shore, and I'm pleased to say that he's doing really well in life and has a great future ahead of him. So, look, my reason for being here has been well and truly beautifully explained by Alex. I really want to be able to share a little with you to help you to understand autism in a greater way. But what we'll do is, first of all, I will share my screen and get this presentation underway, and we'll start with a karakia. Right, Alex, can you just confirm that you can see that okay? You're muted, Alex, but give me the thumbs up.
Yeah, it's okay. Yeah.
Excellent. That's wonderful. Thank you. Right. Now, so it would be good if I can actually work out on my screen here how to move to the next slide. Bear with me, people. My computer has just decided not to cooperate. All right. Okay, so our karakia this evening. E te hui, whaia te mātauranga kia marama, kia whai take ngā mahi katoa, tu maia, tu kaha, aroha atu, aroha mai, tatou ia tatou katoa. And that just translates to English: for this gathering, seek knowledge for understanding, have purpose in all that you do, stand tall, be strong, let us show respect for each other. Right, now just very, very quickly, before we get really into the content of this presentation, it's really important. Language, as we know, we all speak different languages, and our languages are really important. But in consulting with the autistic community, we spend a lot of time asking them about their preferences as to how they would like autism spoken about in New Zealand. And we're hearing from the autistic community that they prefer identity first language. So, what you'll hear me to say tonight is an autistic person, an autistic child. Um, I sometimes will say a person on the autism spectrum, and all of that is in line with our community's preferences. But just a bit of a rider with that, if at any time you're not sure, it's really important to respect and honour the individual person's preferences. So just ask. Right, so the aims of this little presentation tonight, first of all, we're going to talk a little bit about what autism is and what it might look like in our children and our young people in particular. We'll talk a little about pathways to autism and autism diagnosis, and how we can better support autistic children and individuals in our community and in our families. Right, so autism. What is this thing called autism? Autism is simply a neurological condition which affects the way a person perceives the world, communicates, and interacts with others. It's really important that we start to think about autism as being a neurotype. It's a way that the brain is wired. It's not less. It's not a disability. It's not a dysfunctional human being. It is simply a person who is wired a little bit differently. I can just see there's some chat coming through here, so I'm just going to make sure that I've got it on my screen so I don't miss any important questions. And absolutely, as Alex was mentioning, autism is believed to be present in about 1 in 54 people. So, like Alex said, it's highly likely that you will encounter an autistic person in your life, in your family, in your job, out there in the community. And whether they are diagnosed with autism or not, sometimes it's obvious and sometimes it's not. Right. So I'm not going to talk too much about the medical model of autism. Really, all you need to know at this point is that it is the criteria for autism diagnosis is within a very big, lengthy document called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Now, the difficulty with that is that it is a medicalized model of autism, and it lists a whole lot of different deficits and things that might be difficult for the person. However, it's more helpful, and what we prefer to do is focus on the social model of autism. The social model, as you can see on the slide here, talks about the barriers to the child or the person's participation in life in its fullest sense. That also will include attitudes as well as physical barriers. The social model, the great thing about the social model is that we start focusing on a person's strengths, on the things that they can do, the things that they love, the things that they enjoy doing. And we start looking at the accommodations or the supports that that person or that child might need. Now, the very cool thing about this social model and the way of looking at autism from the social model is that we celebrate our differences. We celebrate neurodiversity. But with autism, it's really, really important always to remember that every single autistic person is different. You might know one autistic person, you might know two, or you might know 10, and without a doubt, every single one of those people will be different, and they will have a different set of challenges and strengths and sensitivities. And this little slide really sums it up. If you have met one autistic person, you've simply met one autistic person. Everybody is so different. Now, I've got a little bit of a quote here from a man called Dr. Tony Attwood. He's a very, very well-known clinician, a psychologist working in Australia. And what Tony says, it's a little bit complicated, so you might have to listen really carefully. The person is different, not defective, and deserves respect and admiration for how they cope in a world where most people are not only not autistic, but do not understand someone who is. And the word there really is understand. When we understand, amazing things happen. So when we think about the autism spectrum, a lot of people think about being on the autism spectrum as being quite linear. And as you can see on the slide here, less autistic, more autistic, someone who's high functioning or someone who's low functioning. However, the autism spectrum is more like the diagram on the right-hand side there. I like to describe it as a little bit of a pick and mix, as a little bit of a jumble, I guess you could say, of strengths, of sensitivities, of challenges, and all those kind of things. Somebody could have
英文
amazing,
讲座
very, very good language skills, but might have very, very poor gross motor skills, the things that help us to run and jump and all those sorts of things. They maybe have very, very good executive functioning, which is things like planning and organizing, but they might have some very, very strong sensory sensitivities, and that will look really different for everybody. Now, I think I'll just add at this moment in time also that these slides are going to be made available to you after this presentation. And if you do receive the slides and see a link on the bottom, as you see here, that is a link through to further reading for you and more information, and also some of that source material. So if you've got time, there's a whole lot of really good reading there for you. Right, so let's start looking at some of the differences that our autistic children might demonstrate. So first of all, they may appear to have delayed or limited language development. Quite often when parents are, when their children are in their toddler years, one of the first things that might happen is a parent might take their child for a hearing test, because as you see on that second bullet point, they appear to be unresponsive to attempts at communication. They simply don't seem to hear. And then when that hearing test comes back as all okay, the carers might actually start to think, oh, hang on, there might be something else going on here. And it's very, very common for children to have that delayed language development. Some children go on to develop very, very good verbal language skills, and some children may be what we call non-speaking and go through life communicating in different ways. Our autistic kids may speak or use language differently. They may have an unusual accent, or they may repeat words and phrases. That's called echolalia. And the other thing that's really important about communication is how much of our communication is centered around our body language and our facial expressions. And that's an area that an autistic person may have some challenges in understanding. They may not be able to easily read our body language and the facial expressions that we use when we're communicating. You may have heard, and throw it into chat. Feel free to say yes or put thumbs up and use your responses if any of this is resonating for you. But you may have heard people talking about, oh, autistic people have no empathy. Now, the difficulty there is that what we know about autistic individuals is that they absolutely don't lack empathy. It may simply be that social interactions can be really confusing or difficult for autistic children. They may approach a situation where empathy might be expected and not know how to respond in that situation. It doesn't demonstrate a lack of empathy. It's simply that the autistic child is struggling to understand that social situation, to understand perhaps their own emotions, and they may communicate differently to others. One of the gentlemen that came to one of my social communication workshops a few months ago mentioned that he had a 5-year-old little boy who was autistic. And when one of his friends at school fell over and grazed his knee at school and it was bleeding, his little boy, instead of showing the empathy and support that you would expect of a 5-year-old child, his little boy just started giggling. And of course, that was very, very difficult for the other children to understand. It wasn't that he wasn't feeling any empathy. It was simply that he did not know how to cope. He didn't have the strategies to cope in that situation. And unfortunately, his little friends all read that as he's not a very nice boy. And that actually wasn't what was going on at all. What we know is that human beings are hardwired to connect with others. Think about at the very beginning of COVID and those apartment buildings in Europe and in Asia, actually, where people were confined to their small apartments, but managed to create choirs and orchestras. We connected online. We found amazing ways. We stood at the end of our driveways and had barbecues with our neighborhoods because connection and communication is a very, very strong part of who we are as humans. And so when an autistic child might be communicating differently, it's simply their way of connecting and communicating in a world that might be very confusing and overwhelming for them. Our kids may communicate in some unexpected ways. Right, let's just have a look now at social interaction. Autistic children will often interact socially in quite different ways and often unexpected ways. First of all, they might prefer to play on their own. They might prefer that solitary play. They may not engage in social or imaginative play. So lots of children, autistic children, may really struggle in those group play settings or not enjoy dress ups or singing or dancing or miming. They might be happier just playing with their own little toy or playing in their own way. They may engage and interact in some unexpected ways. They may use toys in a slightly different way, in an unexpected way, instead of taking their little cars and going vroom vroom, as most children would. Our autistic kids might do something like turn them upside down and turn the wheels, try to work out how those wheels work. It's almost always certain that our autistic community will have difficulty in interpreting and understanding social norms, those social rules that we have in our communities and our cultures. We might need to help them and help them to understand. We might need to be interpreters around social communication. What is this person saying to me? What is this person communicating to me? They might need support to learn skills, those skills that children learn at a very early age, things like sharing, turn taking, problem solving, and starting and maintaining a conversation. All of those skills that our children start learning at a very, very, very young age that are so important as we go to school, as we go to university, as we start our jobs, as we continue our careers. Really, really important life skills. And we are going to need to be supporting our kids in those things and helping to learn those things. Our autistic children will also, and actually not just children, but adults as well, may be very literal. What that means is black and white thinking. They may take things at face value. For example, we might say things like, it's raining cats and dogs, that's a metaphor for it's raining really, really hard outside. And the child might take that very literally and run up to the window and look for those cats and dogs. Within the English language, and I'm not 100% sure about in the Chinese languages, I don't know, I'm imagining that you do use quite a lot of metaphors and very descriptive language. And so we have to be really careful that we're explaining that and speaking in very, very simple terms to our children if they do have difficulty understanding some of those things. Jokes, sarcasm, metaphors, and those idioms. You're a star. You're my star. To tell a child that you think they're pretty wonderful and that they're special to you, and that child might not understand why you're calling him a star. And most importantly, our autistic community tell us that they are often very, very easily overwhelmed in those social settings. Social settings being school, being clubs, sports teams, at the supermarket, all of those everyday activities, simple everyday activities can be incredibly overwhelming for our autistic kids. And now we move on to emotions. Emotions, we put a label on this. We call this alexithymia, and that's just a big word for having difficulties in understanding and interpreting my emotions and the emotions of others. So our kids might have difficulties in understanding and labeling their emotions. They might not understand the messages that their body gives them. We call this interoception. And that's the things like when your heart races and you might feel fearful, or when you sweat and you're feeling nervous, if your hands are shaking. All of those things give us some really good clues about how we might be feeling and how we might respond to those emotions. But many of our autistic children will have difficulty in receiving and interpreting that interoception messaging. And so we will need to support them with emotional regulation. Lots of our autistic kids will go from 0 calm to 10 being a complete meltdown in nanoseconds, because they lack the skills and the resources, strategies to be able to stay self-regulated and calm. And lots of things may overwhelm them. Social settings that we've already talked about, sensory differences, differences in communication and interaction, not understanding what's going on around me, lots of information coming in and not being able to process it, or not being able to filter out some of those inputs. trying to listen to a conversation and having other loud noises or other conversations, most of us are able to filter out that stuff. For our autistic kids, that might not be so simple, might not be so easy. And then we look at behavior. Now, first of all, it's really super important when we're talking about behavior that we recognize and understand that we come from the place of all behavior is communication. I'll say that again. All behavior is communication. If we're seeing some adverse or challenging or unexpected behavior in somebody, the question that we want to be asking is why? It's the ideal opportunity. Every behavior will have a why in behind it. So some of the things we might see in autistic children and young people, routine and structure helps autistic kids to not only know what to expect, but to start to make sense of this chaotic, unpredictable world that they live in. They might not understand the layers and layers of unspoken rules and communication that's happening around them, let alone know how to interpret them and then act upon them. So the more certainty, the more routine, sameness, predictability that we can provide for our kids, the better. And I don't think anyone would disagree with me when I say this relates to all human beings. We start to talk about things that are important for all human beings. Think about your own life and your own routines, the things that are the same every day for you that are comforting, and think about what that feels like and looks like when your routine gets disrupted. Or think about what our last 2 years have looked like with all the disruptions and changes and unpredictability of that COVID has brought about. It's been really difficult for everybody. And we've seen anxiety levels rising to unprecedented levels in our community because all human beings thrive in an atmosphere or an environment of sameness, routine, and predictability. Now, think about our autistic kids whose anxiety levels and ability to cope with all of that uncertainty is already up here. It doesn't take very much for those anxiety levels to go off the page and for children to start behaving in some pretty challenging or unexpected ways. So first of all, our kids love routine and sameness. The opposite of that is that they may really struggle with change and moving from one activity to another. Around that sameness and liking things to be predictable, predictability also involves patterns and visual predictability. Lots of our kids really enjoy things like lining things up and organizing things in a particular way or a particular pattern. They may have special interests and enthusiasms. I've already talked about difficulty changing from one activity to another. We've also talked about difficulties with emotional regulation and not having the skills and resources and strategies they may need to stay calm, to stay emotionally regulated. And you might see some unusual behaviors. We call this stimming, self-stimulatory behavior, which is things like flapping, jumping, spinning, clapping their hands, repeating words. And those behaviors all serve a really important purpose for autistic people. It might help them to stay grounded. It might help them to understand what's being communicated to them. It might help them to stay calm. It might be their expression of their excitement or their delight. The important thing to know about these behaviors is that they serve a really important purpose for our kids. And the other thing that we will touch on next is sensory sensitivities. Right, so sensory processing. Just about every autistic person I have ever met will tell me about their distinct differences in the way that they process and interpret sensory information. And these fall into a couple of key areas. One being hyper responsiveness, so very sensitive to some sensory input. Hyposensitive, which means that they have very low registration around some sensory inputs. And then some autistic children will also have sensory interests. So maybe sensory seeking, looking to get that sensory input that they find pleasing or calming. So let's just dig a little bit further into those different sensory areas. So as you will all know, we've got 5 main senses: our sight, smell, taste, our hearing, and our touch. But there's 3 extras, and this is all incredible for me. I mean, I'm speaking for myself. I find these 3 extra sensory areas absolutely fascinating because they tell me a lot about human behavior, about how we are as individuals and how we behave and why we behave in certain ways. So the first one is vestibular, and that's to do all inner ear kind of balance stuff and about movement. The second, that's the information that our body receives from, our brain receives from our vestibular system. The second one is proprioception. This is around our body awareness, where we kind of fit in the space that we occupy, where my body ends and somebody else starts, that kind of stuff. And then we have interoception, and that is the information that our brain receives from within our body, our internal organs. That's stuff like needing to go to the toilet, when I'm feeling hungry or thirsty, when I'm feeling tired, all that kind of stuff. And that is very, very heavily linked to emotional regulation. Our children may also have struggles and difficulties around executive function, especially those children who may have a co-occurring condition of ADHD, and that's actually quite common with autistic children. So these are the skills around planning, organizing, and problem solving, our working memory. So you can imagine, with all of these different things going on, anxiety, fear, frustration, overwhelm can build up. And we think about it like a Coke bottle, as you see in the picture here. If you take that Coke bottle and you shake it for long enough, what's going to happen when you take the lid off? That emotional energy, that overwhelm, it has to go somewhere. And we see explosions. We see adverse, challenging behavior. We see a child who is overwhelmed, and we see a brain that is no longer able to cope. If you're interested in digging into any of this information, like sensory or social communication or anxiety, a little deeper, do take note of our contact details at the end, because we run 2-hour workshops on all of those areas, and I'm just glancing over them tonight so that we can cover lots and lots of material for you. Right. As you can, I love this quote: attitude is the paintbrush of the mind. It colors everything we see and hear. If you view a child as being willful, disobedient, disrespectful, destructive, all my favorite D words that I'd like to see a big black line put through, and we put that to one side, and or perhaps we turn that around and we frame it as a child who is overwhelmed, has intense sensory differences, is very anxious, is uncertain, we treat them in a very different way. Attitude is the paintbrush of the mind. It colors everything that we see and hear. Hence why I'm talking with you tonight. When we apply understanding, we understand the whys of the behavior that we see, we can better support our autistic kids. And for them, that means that they and their families are going to have a much more positive life. So let's talk a little about pathways to an autism diagnosis. Now, this looks different wherever you might be, whether it's overseas, things are done very differently overseas, and even outside of Auckland, it can look a little bit different. But there's basically two pathways to assessment for autism in New Zealand. The first way, and most families do go this through the public funded assessment. And that means meeting with your GP, discussing your concerns. And what I would say here is it's really important before you do that, if you do suspect your child or a member of your family may be autistic or on the autism spectrum, do lots of reading. Knowledge is power. You can then talk about the various aspects that you might see in the child and how that relates to an autism diagnosis. You might take some notes about some of the behaviors that you've seen, and all of that adds up to helping with that diagnostic process. What will happen there from talking with your GP is that you will get a referral to your closest DHB. And while each DHB, Auckland, Manukau, and Counties Manukau and Waitemata are all different, generally you'll be referred to the child development team. And they all have a multidisciplinary approach, which means there's several different professionals all assessing your child and coming together to determine whether an autism diagnosis is appropriate or not. The second pathway is a private assessment. And I have to be really honest, lots of people are choosing to go down the private path at the moment because there is such a backlog in getting seen by the DHBs. So what does this look like? Well, you don't need a referral typically. Most diagnosing clinicians will not require a referral. And this is likely to be a developmental pediatrician or a psychologist who is experienced in diagnosing autism. Just note, however, that even within the public system, there is significant wait time. I'm hearing something like 6 months to be able to get an appointment with a private clinician. And some clinicians have actually closed their books because they don't have any more capacity. And if you want to know more about that, you can see I've put a link there for you, and perhaps Alex will pop that into the chat for you also, where you can pop onto the Autism New Zealand website, and there's a lot more information about an autism diagnosis. So what happens next? Let's just say you've received an autism diagnosis for your child. And I'm going to get really personal right now and just share what it felt like for me. For me, even though we'd known that our son was different for quite some time, he was my first son. So we had nothing, he was my only child at that point, and we had nothing to compare it to. We just adored him, we loved him, but we knew he was a little bit different. He did things differently to other children, and he was developing at a different rate than his peers. For example, when he was 4.5, he didn't have many words. We knew that he didn't have any intellectual disability. We already knew he was a pretty smart kid, but he didn't use many words. And so we had an appointment set for him with a speech and language therapist. Unfortunately, school was getting closer. He was going to be starting school at 5. And I was really concerned that he didn't really talk. So when I rang up the speech and language therapy to find out how long it was going to take to be seen by them, and found out it was going to be at least another month or so, I did get very concerned. But lo and behold, and such has been the nature of my son's progression, about 3 weeks later, Fergus, my son, walked up to me and asked me for something using a full sentence. I could not believe it. It was just, it seemed ridiculous to go from just 1 or 2 words to a full sentence overnight. And after that, he never stopped talking. Just keep in mind that every single child is different, and that might not be the same for your child or for other children that you meet. But what I felt when he was diagnosed, he was diagnosed at 5.5, was an absolute sense of grief. First of all, actually, my first reaction was one of relief, because at least then I knew what we were dealing with, my husband and I were dealing with. But my next emotion was grief. I cried. To me, it seemed terrifying. I didn't know what his future was going to be like. I didn't know if he was going to be reliant on me for the rest of his life. I didn't know whether he was going to be able to hold down a job, to find a partner, to have children, and all those kind of things. So I grieved. And what I found out and what I know now is that's a very, very normal response to receiving that diagnosis. Lots and lots of parents go through that process. However, the more my child has developed and grown and learnt, I no longer see it like that. The child that I had at 5 is very, very different to the beautiful young man that I have at 15, who is in all likelihood, if we can get him through school, because school is not a great place for autistic kids, for most autistic kids. It's challenging. If we can get him happily through school, my very, very clever boy is going to go on and do something amazing. And right now he's focusing on becoming an expert in cybersecurity, because that is his special interest. And you know what? I think he'll probably do that. So just keep in mind, the 5-year-old that you see here is not the adult that you see down there, especially if you know what you're dealing with and how to support and how to and understand your child's differences. But what I would say to you in that is, for that support, for that understanding, for that listening ear, for people that just understand and get it, your next step should be to contact us at Autism New Zealand. Many of us are parents, many of us have been there. We have lots of different cultures within our organisation, and what I do believe we provide is a whole lot of support and walking alongside families as they're starting and continuing on their journey. Your next step is a needs assessment with your NASC. Now in Auckland, our NASC, or our Needs Assessment and Coordination Service, is Taikura Trust. And generally what happens is that process is triggered by the diagnosis. Your diagnosing clinician or the DHB will send your details or your child's details through to Taikura Trust, and within a few weeks they will be in contact to do a needs assessment. And you can request that needs assessment every year, every couple of years, and they will continue to assess your child throughout their life and as they change and grow, for whatever needs that might be. Now, the thing is, it's really, we have to be really realistic here that there is not a huge amount of support. If your child has very intense needs, needs lots of support, then the NASC will work with you to determine what funding is available. Yes, you're right. It could be. I was trying to be positive around that, but actually you're absolutely right. Why 3 months or so for Taikura at the moment? Yeah, COVID has really affected wait lists and timeframes out there. Yes, in the community. So there's not a huge amount available unless your child has very significant needs, in which they will talk through the options with you. For a child like my son, for example, who attends a mainstream school, there's things like the child disability allowance through WINS, which I do encourage people to access. It's not income tested, and in our family we use that for activities for our son that help him in his learning and his development. So things like piano lessons or computer classes, that kind of stuff. It's not much money. I think it's about $40 a week, but it all helps to pay for those sorts of things. You will also be able to access carer support, which is respite care. And that comes through the Ministry of Health. And that is just a little bit of money that helps you to be able to pay someone to care for your child so that you can have a little bit of a rest or some time out. And that's really, really important for all parents. Yeah. 55, has it gone up, Stella? That's fantastic. But that respite care, I would encourage you to look at that very, very carefully, because what I do know is that we all need a chance as parents and as caregivers to top up our batteries, to charge our batteries, to fill up our cups, and to be able to take a rest and to focus on some of the things that we enjoy. Because I think you would all agree with me that being a parent is a really, really big job. It's a hard job. It's hard work. But being the parent of a child who has additional needs or differences is even more so. So we do need to reach out for that support sometimes. Your next step will be, if your child is of school age, is to meet with your child's school or the ECE to discuss the diagnosis and any supports or accommodations that your child is going to need. Now, again, that's going to be really, really different in every school and in every ECE. Some schools have got lots of autism understanding, some schools not so much, and really need to be taking on some autism education. I can't dig too far into that tonight because we just don't have the time, but feel free to reach out to me at any time if you need help in communicating with your school on that stuff. Right, and the last couple of minutes before, I really do want to give you time for some questions, Q&A. So I'm just going to very, very quickly race through these tips, and hopefully you'll be able to access these slides afterwards so you can read on. The only thing I will do before I continue, I'm going to show you this book here. I will also get Alex to pop it into the chat. It's called Uniquely Human by Barry M. Present. And if I think about it, I might even throw it into the chat here if I can keep talking to you. And if you read no other books about autism, I would suggest that this is the book that you read. It makes a whole lot of sense. And it, see, here I go. I don't have an amazing brain like my son. I can only do one thing at a time. Whereas my amazing autistic son has this incredible ability to do several things at once, which I just think is so incredible. I'm going to write this into the notes here for you and hit the button. There we go. But this book, Uniquely Human, it's got a subtitle of A Different Way of Seeing Autism. And when you start reading it, you may even cry happy tears. You may recognize your child, and you will certainly appreciate the positive input from that particular author. Right, so here's some top tips. We're going to race through these. Apologies. Why is it not clicking through? There we go. Oh my goodness, now they're all going at the same time. Right, number one. Why is it doing that? Clearly, something going on with my internet. Okay, number one, give children the space to be their authentic selves. They will spend a lot of time out there in the community trying to look less autistic, putting on a mask of coping, of a veneer of coping. Let's let home be their safe space where they can just be themselves. If they want to come home from school and strip off their clothes and run around naked in the backyard, let's let them do that if it's something that they find calming and pleasing. Number two, keep our communication really, really simple. Clear instructions, reduce your language, and scaffold your instructions. They may not be able to understand or process your verbal instructions. Maybe you might give them something visually. Maybe you might write something on a post-it note or have a chart or a planner on the wall to help them. And I apologize, I am racing through these very, very quickly. Relationship, the opposite to calm. Yes, the opposite to anxiety isn't calm, it's trust. I love that quote. The opposite to anxiety is not calm, it's trust. Be your child's trusted, reliable, consistent person. lots of positive praise. And if you're struggling to get your child's attention, if you're struggling with their learning, if you're struggling to get them to play and connect with you, do it via their special interests, the things that they love. If they're into Pokemon, engage with them around Pokemon, create visuals around Pokemon, make everything about Pokemon, and you're going to get their attention. Same thing if it was My Little Pony or Fortnite. Moving on to tip number 8, we raced through those last tips, didn't we? Sameness, routine, and predictability. This is my mantra: sameness, routine, and predictability. Create routine and structure. Explain what's going to happen next. Remove the unknown, and always prepare for all changes so that the child can make sense, can prepare for that and process it themselves, starting to reduce anxiety. Number 9, keeping calm, teaching and modeling emotional regulation. How do I feel and what do I do when I'm feeling like this? Providing calming spaces, calming activities. That's going to look really different for every child. And always check in around their sensory differences, the sensory things that they might find uncomfortable, confusing, or overwhelming. And number 10, working together. One of my colleagues said to me the other day, and I just love this. She said to me, you know what, Jo, we have to work with these kids. They're not stupid. Stupid is not part of an autism diagnosis. These kids are not stupid. They know what works for them. They know, even those children who are not yet speaking, know what feels really good, what they like, what they don't like, what they enjoy. So work with the child, ask them what will work for you. What would you like? Give them choices. Choices reduces anxiety. Wherever possible, adapt the environment. We as parents, caregivers, and neurotypical people are much more able to change than our autistic children. So how about we change, we adapt the environment, we adapt our communication, and we meet those kids halfway across the bridge instead of trying to drag them across the bridge. And that's what, sorry, I've actually jumped onto that next point: adjusting our behavior, our communication, and our teaching to meet our children's needs. So that brings us to Q&A time, and I do apologize that I've had to race through that all very, very quickly. I could literally sit here for 3 or 4 or 5 hours expanding on all of those points for you, but I absolutely welcome your questions at this point if anyone has any.
Cool. Thank you so much, Joe, for your informative workshop. I think we definitely have a great learning about how to identify, how to understand, how to support the people who has autism. And yeah, we got some questions here. And first question from Joe. Joe is asking, so the pediatrician assessment mainly for diagnosis, while the NASC is about intervention and social financial support. Is that correct? I think it's correct.
Yes, I guess hopefully I'm answering this correctly. A diagnosis is not essential to receive support in school. So that's really important to note, that your child's needs at school and a school being able to provide support is not based upon a diagnosis. So you don't necessarily need to go and get a diagnosis, but it does trigger some levels of intervention and support. And it might also provide a little bit of extra understanding if you can label it. And it might help those who don't have a deep understanding of neurodiversity and our differences to be able to, I guess you could say it's that attitude is the paintbrush of the mind. If they know your child is autistic, they may treat them differently or better or provide supports, but it is not essential.
Cool. So, Joe, my understanding is even seek help from your agency can be without
Yes.
diagnosis, right?
Yes. And look, we apart from some registration fees to our workshops and programs, everything that we do is provided for free. So you can ring us, we could meet with you. There's various different ways of engaging with our organization, and it won't cost you anything. I just saw that question there from May. Are you happy for me to answer that,
Yeah, sure.
Alex?
Yeah, go for it.
So May says, what does the life for an autistic adult look like? So just to answer that question, it will look really, really different for everybody. If I think about some of the autistic adults I know, we have autistic adults on our team at Autism New Zealand. And if you walked into our Autism New Zealand offices, you probably would not have any clue that they were autistic. They lead very, very happy, fulfilled lives, but they view life through a very different lens to me. And then I know autistic adults who have very, very intense and very high support needs. So it can be anything and in between. And again, Autism New Zealand provides support from 0 to 120, if that's how long you're going to live.
Okay, cool. Thank you, Joe, for your answer. And I think I can give you guys a reminder about because this workshop is being recorded, if you want to see the videos and to review it, you can go to YouTube channel and we will post it on our Asian Family Services YouTube video. You can simply just search Asian Family Services and follow us. And this after editing and this video going to be posted there. And if you want this PowerPoint, you can email to help@asianfamilyservices.nz. It's in the chat window as well. So when you just send an email asking for this slide, I mean the PowerPoint, and then we can just email it to you. So we got some questions here. So Joe, can you say it from the question from why? I got some.
Why?
Yeah.
Yes. Why is asking what other kind of services that Autism New Zealand offers, and why mentions that they know Denise. And yes, Denise works in our employment services. So we have several different departments. We have outreach, which is our team of outreach coordinators around New Zealand providing support and information to autistic individuals and their whānau. We have our employment services. So people actually Denise works in transition to employment. So from secondary school into transitioning into life and employment. And then we have a couple of people who work in our employment team, and that is helping autistic individuals to achieve jobs and careers and supporting them in those. Then we have our education team, which I sit within, and we provide various programs. We provide education to the educators. So we have a Ministry of Education contract to deliver education to teachers and learning support coordinators. We also do family and community workshops and full day and 2-day autism programs. So there's quite a lot. I'm just trying to think if there's anything we've missed. No, I think that covers everything. But we have quite a large staff. I think we have about 30 on our team spread across New Zealand.
Yeah, I just shared your website. So people, if you want to explore those services, you can always go to Autism NZ website to have a look. And we got a question from Shui Fang, is asking if a child has language delay as well as autism. Should they see a language therapist or a specialist on autism?
Yes, I would be guided by professionals on that, but generally, if there's a language delay and it's causing concern, then being assessed by a speech and language therapist would be a really good idea. It is important to note, though, that in those early years, 2 to 3 years old, you might see some very distinct differences in language development, and they may resolve themselves. But if you're unsure or if you're concerned at any age or stage, it's really probably the best thing to do is to touch base with an appropriate professional, your pediatrician, or if they're an ECE, with the early intervention teacher. They might be able to guide you on that.
Okay, thank
Oh,
you,
the
Joe.
child is 8. Yes, so at 8, definitely be touching base with a speech and language therapist.
Thank you, Joe, for answering Shuifang's question. We got a question from Stella. If school is not suitable for autistic child, what other options can the child have apart from the homeschooling?
I did say that quite flippantly, I have to admit. And it's really a comment based around what the perfect world might look like for education for an autistic child. And I think that the New Zealand education system is coming on in leaps and bounds and starting to understand that all children learn differently and will have different learning needs, but we're a long way from having an education system that truly meets those needs. So it's a very personal thing. I mean, homeschooling is not for everybody, and it may not actually work well for that child. They're all different. I think probably the most important thing is to pick a school that you feel might be the right fit for your child's needs, where you feel that they have an understanding of your child's needs and have the right supports and accommodations available for your child. Failing that, there's not too many other options. There are a few private providers around. I can't recommend any because I just don't know how things are happening, what it's looking like in those spaces. But it's a very, very personal. Education is such a personal thing, and it will be different for everybody. I'm
Hey,
just looking at
Joe.
some of these questions. There's a lot there, isn't there, Alex?
Yeah. So I think some of the questions can go to you privately. I mean, after they can always email you or give you a call.
Yes,
Or
I absolutely welcome that. I'm just going
shall
to
we?
I'm going to respond to Darcy.
Yeah.
Is it possible that autism is diagnosed as schizophrenia? Um, Look, it used to be that was the case. I would like to think that our diagnosing clinicians have a much better handle on things now. We do see some, in particular, some women. The female presentation of autism doesn't fit comfortably with the DSM-5 diagnostic criteria, and some of those women might be diagnosed with ADHD or borderline personality disorder or an anxiety disorder. Schizophrenia, maybe, but I'm not a psychologist. I would suggest that if you are suspecting autism, to go and see another psychologist or psychiatrist who might be able to help with that. It's a little bit outside of my area of expertise.
Okay, thank you, Joe. I think this is I got this similar question because to diagnose mental health issues for young people is quite hard, right? Because they are still growing and still developing. It's very hard to diagnose. Oh, your behavior is meeting these symptoms, or your symptom is this kind of meeting these criteria. So I think it's quite hard. We should leave these questions to those specialists or psychiatrists.
Absolutely. Yeah. And look, the thing about a diagnosis of autism, it can be very difficult to diagnose in those early years, like you say, Alex.
Yeah.
Some clinicians don't want to diagnose until certain ages and stages, 5 or 6. Others feel more comfortable with their experience in those spaces. So, you do see, and some children that have very high needs might be diagnosed very, very early, say even as young as 18 months old. And the good thing about that is what we know about autism is that the earlier we can intervene, and when I say intervene, I'm not talking about coming in with therapies, and we're not trying to fix this. We're actually talking about a differently wired human being. Those interventions will be about understanding their communication, understanding their sensory differences, and providing the supports that they might need.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much, Joel. So in terms of the time, I think we can, stop asking questions. And we left over one question from Joy, but Joy, this question is quite individual. Feel free to send send emails to Joel. I already put Joel's email again on in the chat windows. So please asking these individual questions to Joel. And guys, I probably can repeat, if you want the recording, the videos, and go to YouTube channels and just follow us, Asian Family Services. If you want the PowerPoint, you just email help@asianfamilyservices.nz, and then we will post send it to you. If you have more questions, and please feel free to email Joe. I think Joe, our Joe's colleague is happy to answer your questions. And thank you for the other expert who answering or sharing the experience in the chat windows. We learned the actual practice from you as well. Yeah, thank you. Yeah,
Fantastic.
Thank you, people. Yeah, for your time tonight. Yeah, thank you for joining this workshop, and thank you for sharing your experiences.
Ka kite, everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I will stop recording and stop this workshop. Thank you so much. And if you have any questions, you can always call our helpline or 0800 number, which is 0800 862 342. And then if you missed out something, you can always ask us. We will help you to get it. Yeah. This is our Asian helpline. We speak 8 Asian languages. Thank you. Thank you, Camilla.
Thank you. I'll sign off now, Alex.
Okay, cool.
Thank you so much. And I will be in touch soon. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.